Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into a book that really surprised me. Singapore, The Unexpected Nation by Edwin Lee. I have to admit, I thought a history of Singapore might be a bit dry. But this book was anything but.
It's a fascinating story, isn't it? Full of twists and turns you wouldn't expect.
Exactly. It's like a real-life underdog story. How did this tiny island nation, with practically no natural resources, become the global powerhouse it is today? That's the central question Lee tackles.
And he does it brilliantly, weaving together history, politics, economics, and even a touch of social psychology.
Before we jump in, let's give our listener a quick overview. Essentially, the book charts Singapore's journey from a colonial trading post to an independent nation. Lee explores the challenges of forging a national identity in a diverse society, the role of key figures like Lee Kuan Yew, and the constant tension between economic pragmatism and preserving cultural heritage.
Right. And what makes the book so compelling is that it doesn't shy away from the complexities and contradictions. It's not just a celebration of success, it's a nuanced look at the choices and trade-offs that shaped Singapore's unique path.
Okay, so let's start in the beginning. The book opens with Singapore's early history, back when it was known as Kamasek. Lee really brings this period to life, describing the arrival of Stanford Raffles in 1819 and the maneuvering for control with the local Malay rulers. It's almost like an adventure novel.
It's a reminder that Singapore's strategic location has always been crucial. Even in those early days, it was all about trade, about being a hub connecting East and West.
Speaking of trade, the book dives deep into how Singapore's role as an entrepot, a central trading port, was key to its early development. But you put it on something interesting to me. It wasn't just about what happened on the island itself, right?
Exactly. Lee emphasizes the concept of the hinterland, meaning Singapore's economic fate was always intertwined with the surrounding regions, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and beyond. It was never an isolated entity.
So even from its earliest days, Singapore was outward-looking, connected to the wider world.
Absolutely. And that theme, that focus on global connections and trade, it runs throughout Singapore's entire history.
Okay, so we've got this trading hub, strategically located, connected to the region, but the book doesn't sugarcoat things. Singapore faced some serious challenges along the way, right?
Oh, absolutely. World wars, economic depressions, communist insurgency, racial tensions. Lee doesn't shy away from these difficult chapters, and that's where the personal stories he weaves into the narrative really shine.
You're right. For example, we meet Muhammad Yunus Abdullah, described in the book as the first real Singaporean. He advocated for Malay rights, while navigating both the traditional Malay world and this rapidly modernizing colonial society.
He's a fascinating figure. Through his newspaper, he even helped introduce this new concept of a nation to the Malay community. Then there's Tan Kah-kee, a wealthy Hokkien businessman who championed Chinese education and saw Singapore as a base to support China's own struggles. Both men deeply devoted to their communities, reflecting the complexities of identity in early 20th century Singapore.
And these tensions, these different visions for what Singapore should be, they really come to a head after World War II, don't they?
They do. The British return with this idea of a Malayan Union, meant to unify Malaya and Singapore, granting equal citizenship regardless of ethnicity.
Sounds pretty progressive for the time.
It was, but it triggered a huge backlash, especially from Malay nationalists who felt it threatened their special position. The book does a great job of capturing the fervor of these debates. English-educated radicals pushing for an inclusive Malayan identity, Chinese-educated nationalists focused on their community's interests. And in the midst of it all, the Malayan Communist Party trying to capitalize on the instability, it was a real cauldron of competing ideologies.
And it's into this chaos that Lee Kuan Yew steps onto the stage, right?
Exactly. This young, Cambridge-educated lawyer who would become absolutely central to Singapore's story.
I have to admit, when I started the book, I didn't know much about Lee Kuan Yew. But he comes across as this incredibly complex figure, brilliant, driven, but well, let's just say he wasn't afraid to wield power.
He was a pragmatist above all else. He believed that Singapore's survival depended on rapid modernization and forging a cohesive national identity, even if it meant making tough and sometimes unpopular decisions.
For instance, the book talks about his insistence on merging with Malaya, which didn't exactly go smoothly.
It was a calculated gamble. Lee saw the economic benefits of being part of a larger federation, but underestimated the political challenges. The book does a great job of taking us behind the scenes of those negotiations, the eventual union in 1963, and then just 2 years later, that dramatic separation.
Wow, talk about unexpected. So here we have Singapore, suddenly thrust into independence. With all these internal divisions and external threats, what happens next?
This is where things get really interesting. We see Lee Kuan Yew's leadership truly put to the test. He and his team were essentially building a nation from scratch, with no real blueprint to follow.
So how did they do it? Where did they even begin?
They had to improvise, adapt, and make some incredibly bold decisions. Think about it. Singapore had no real military tradition, a severe housing shortage, and limited natural resources. Yet they managed to create a strong defense force, a world-class public housing system, and a thriving economy, all within a few decades.
It's mind-boggling. You mentioned the lack of military tradition. The book talks about how Lee Kuan Yew pushed for mandatory national service, which was hugely controversial at the time.
It was a gamble, but Lee saw it as essential for survival, not just for defense, but also for forging a sense of national unity. By requiring every young man to serve, he was creating a shared experience, a common purpose that transcended ethnic or social divides. You could argue that national service became a crucible where Singaporean identity was forged.
It's fascinating how they used policies not just for practical purposes, but also for social engineering. And speaking of social engineering, we can't talk about Singapore without mentioning the public housing program. The book describes how they transformed the housing landscape, going from slums and overcrowded shop houses to these modern HDB flats.
It was an incredibly ambitious undertaking. And again, it wasn't just about bricks and mortar. Public housing was a key tool for nation building. By creating mixed-income communities, they fostered social integration and a sense of ownership.
So they were literally building a nation block by block.
In many ways, yes, but physical infrastructure was only part of the equation. Lee and his team recognized that education was crucial for Singapore's success.
Right. The book talks about their emphasis on bilingualism, STEM subjects, and creating a meritocratic system where success was based on ability, not background. It sounds like they were trying to mold a very specific kind of citizen.
That's a great observation. They were shaping a society that valued pragmatism, efficiency, and a can-do spirit. This focus on education was also tied to their strategy of attracting foreign talent and investment. Which brings us back to that theme of global connectivity.
Makes sense. To be a global hub, you need a highly skilled workforce. And the book describes how Singapore went all in on courting multinational companies, creating a business-friendly environment that made the island a magnet for investment.
And this strategy paid off handsomely. By the 1970s, Singapore was experiencing phenomenal economic growth. It had become a global financial center and a manufacturing powerhouse.
It's hard to believe how quickly they achieved all this. But the book also hints at a downside to this rapid transformation.
Yes, and this is where things get really interesting. Lee explores how Singapore's very success created new challenges. The rapid economic growth, while essential for survival, also posed a threat to national identity.
That seems counterintuitive. How could economic success be a threat?
Well, as people become more affluent, they tend to focus more on individual aspirations and less on communal values. It becomes more about me and less about us.
I see. So how did the government try to address this?
They launched a number of initiatives aimed at promoting social cohesion and a sense of belonging. One example is the emphasis on shared values. They actively promoted Confucian ideals like filial piety, hard work, and respect for authority, hoping to instill a kind of social glue that would bind people together.
It's almost like they were trying to counterbalance the individualistic tendencies of a market-driven society with a dose of collectivism.
Exactly. And these values were reinforced through education public campaigns, even through the arts and media. There was a conscious effort to shape a distinctly Singaporean culture.
The book mentions the Speak Mandarin campaign, which aimed to unite the Chinese community around a common language. And then there was the push to create a national literature and art scene that reflected Singaporean experiences.
Right, but these efforts weren't without controversy. Some people criticized them as being too engineered, too artificial. They saw it as an attempt to impose a top-down manufactured culture, rather than letting it evolve organically.
That's a great point. It seems like there's always been this tension in Singapore between individual expression and social control. But despite the challenges, they seem to have managed this balancing act quite well.
They have. And as Singapore continued to develop, new dilemmas emerged, particularly in the face of globalization.
Right. I remember the book talking about how globalization posed a unique set of challenges for nation building. How so?
Well, to compete in a globalized economy, Singapore had to attract foreign talent and investment. This influx of foreigners, while economically beneficial, also raised anxieties about eroding the sense of what it meant to be Singaporean.
It's that classic tension again. Economic pragmatism versus national identity. Did they find a way to reconcile those competing forces?
They tried. The book describes various initiatives aimed at fostering a stronger sense of community and belonging. Things like the community development councils. It was an attempt to recapture that kampong spirit, that traditional sense of community and mutual support, in a rapidly modernizing and increasingly diverse society.
Ah, the kampong spirit. The book mentions this idea a few times. What exactly does it mean?
It's a bit hard to translate directly, but it essentially refers to that sense of community you find in traditional villages,
Huh.
where people look out for one another, help each other out, and share a strong sense of belonging. It's about social cohesion, shared values, and a deep connection to place.
That's beautiful. But I imagine it's tough to maintain that spirit in a modern, urbanized society.
It is. And the book doesn't shy away from the challenges. It acknowledges the anxieties about social stratification, the widening income gap, and the perception that foreigners were benefiting more than ordinary Singaporeans. These were real concerns that the government had to address.
So if we step back and look at the book as a whole, what does it tell us about Singapore's journey as an unexpected nation?
I think one of the key takeaways is the sheer adaptability of Singapore's leaders. They were constantly adjusting their approach to nation building in response to changing circumstances. They experimented, they made tough choices, they learned from their mistakes.
It almost sounds like they were making things up as they went along.
In some ways they were, but there was a guiding principle throughout, a deep pragmatism that put practical results ahead of ideology. And this pragmatism, coupled with a relentless focus on education, economic development, and social cohesion is arguably what propelled Singapore to success.
It's remarkable. But the book doesn't just focus on policies and systems, does it? It also delves into the personalities that shaped Singapore's destiny, particularly Lee Kuan Yew.
He looms large over the entire narrative. The book doesn't sugarcoat his flaws, his authoritarian tendencies, his sometimes ruthless political maneuvering. But it also paints him as a visionary leader who was deeply committed to Singapore's success. He had an unwavering belief in its potential and pursued that vision relentlessly.
The book is full of these little anecdotes that reveal his personality, like how he learned Mandarin in his 40s to better connect with the Chinese-speaking population, or how he continued to groom a new generation of leaders even in his later years. He was always thinking about the future, wasn't he?
Always. He was a master strategist, always thinking several steps ahead. He recognized that for Singapore to thrive, it needed a constant influx of fresh thinking and talent. Even though the book ends in 2005, his legacy continues to shape Singapore's political landscape and its self-perception as a nation.
It's incredible how one individual can have such a profound impact. But what about Singapore's story beyond Lee Kuan Yew? That's something that kept popping into my head as I finished the book. Where does Singapore go from here?
That's a great question. And I think it's time we leave our listener with a final thought to ponder as well. What's one thing, something not explicitly mentioned in the book, that you think our listener can mull over based on what they've learned? What's fascinating is that Lee's book focuses primarily on the role of the state in shaping Singapore's trajectory. But as we move deeper into the 21st century, the question becomes, can a nation built on pragmatism and efficiency also cultivate the creativity and individualism needed to thrive in an increasingly complex and unpredictable world?
That's a really interesting question. The book makes it clear that Singapore's success was largely due to this top-down centralized approach. But can that same approach foster the kind of innovation and adaptability needed in a world that's constantly changing?
Right. It's almost like Singapore needs to reconcile its legacy of social engineering with a greater embrace of individual initiative, and maybe even a bit of healthy disruption.
It makes you think about that line from the book, about the government's desire to create a society where every child, regardless of language, culture, or religion, would have equal opportunity to make the most of himself. What does making the most of oneself even look like in the 21st century?
Exactly. Is it about fitting into a predetermined mold, or is it about forging your own path, even if it means challenging the status quo? It's a question worth considering.
It's like Singapore needs to find a way to balance its traditional strengths. Discipline efficiency, a focus on meritocracy, with a new kind of dynamism, a willingness to embrace risk and even failure.
I think you've hit on something crucial there, because in the end, a nation's greatest resource isn't its economic output, but its people. Their creativity, their resilience, their ability to adapt and thrive in the face of new challenges.
I love that. It really makes you think about the future of not just Singapore, but any nation trying to find its place in this rapidly changing world. So much to ponder.
It does, doesn't it? And for me, that's the real power of Lee's book. It's not just a history lesson. It's an invitation to grapple with these fundamental questions. about what it means to be a nation to belong to forge a shared future in a world that's constantly in flux.
It's definitely a thought-provoking read. You know what I think? I'm going to go back and reread that passage about the opening of the National University of Singapore in 1965. It really captured that sense of optimism and ambition that defined those early years of independence.
That's a great one. It's full of that energy and hope. And it reminds us that every nation, regardless of its size or history, has the potential to create something truly extraordinary.
Well said. On that note, I want to encourage you listening to check out Singapore, the unexpected nation, for yourself. You'll be surprised by how much it makes you think. Not just about Singapore, but about the challenges and possibilities facing all of us in this interconnected world.
It's a journey worth taking.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Singapore, the unexpected nation, folks. We'll see you next time on Books and Bytes.